Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the warm, dusty arenas of the ancient Mediterranean. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe let your phone rest gently beside you. There's no rush. No urgent battles to win. Only sand. And sunlight. And the faint sound of a crowd that has been cheering for several hours and is, frankly, getting a bit tired. Tonight we're asking a question that sounds dramatic, but we'll handle it gently. What happened to gladiators after they lost? Not in the loud, cinematic way. Not in the dramatic, slow-motion fall-to-the-sand way. But in the quieter, bureaucratic, paperwork-heavy aftermath. Because as it turns out, the Roman Empire did very little without paperwork. Even when someone had just been stabbed in front of 40,000 people. So let's ease into it. First, a small myth to set aside, like a heavy helmet at the end of a long day. Not every gladiator who lost, died. I know. Slightly disappointing if you were promised constant carnage. But Rome, for all its dramatic flair, was also practical. And gladiators were expensive. They required food, training, housing, medical care, branding irons, and occasionally very decorative helmets shaped like fish. You don't throw away an investment lightly. Gladiators were typically owned by a manager called a lanista. Think of him as part coach, part businessman, part morally flexible entrepreneur. He ran a gladiator school, known as a ludus. The most famous of these was the Ludus Magnus in Rome itself, conveniently located near the Colosseum so the men could walk to work. Very efficient. Very Roman. Most gladiators were enslaved people. Prisoners of war. Criminals. Or occasionally volunteers who had made such spectacularly poor life choices that fighting in an arena seemed like a step up. Which says quite a lot about their previous circumstances. When a gladiator entered the arena, the fight was often structured. There were referees. There were rules. There were weapon pairings designed for spectacle. A heavily armored Murmillo might face a lightly equipped Retiarius with a net and trident. It was less chaotic brawl, more carefully choreographed violence. And crucially, many matches were not intended to end in death. If a gladiator was wounded or clearly outmatched, he could signal surrender. Usually by raising a finger. A small gesture. Quiet. Almost polite. As if saying, yes, I've had enough stabbing for one afternoon, thank you. Violence. At that point, the decision shifted to the editor of the games, the official sponsoring the event. Often a wealthy politician eager to impress the crowd. Because nothing says, vote for me, like responsible arena management. The crowd would shout. They would gesture. Contrary to popular belief, the famous thumbs down may not have meant death in the way we imagine. Roman gestures were complicated. They enjoyed ambiguity. But here's the key thing. The editor had to consider cost. A trained gladiator could take years to develop. If he performed well, drew excitement, and survived multiple bouts, he became valuable. Killing him after one bad afternoon would be financially unwise. So quite often, a defeated gladiator was spared. Especially if he had fought bravely. Especially if the crowd liked him. Especially if the sponsor didn't want to reimburse the lanista for a dead asset. Because yes, if a gladiator died in the arena, the sponsor had to compensate the owner. Imagine receiving a bill for one deceased Murmillo. Itemized. Helmet damage, severe. Shield, cracked. Human, expired. Naturally, they preferred to avoid that. So what happened next? If spared, the defeated gladiator was escorted out of the arena. Not to a triumphant parade. Not to applause. But back through the gates. Back into the shade. Back to the ludus. And here, the story becomes oddly domestic. Gladiators had barracks. Small cells. Communal training yards. They lived together, trained together, and ate a specific diet heavy in barley and beans. They were sometimes called horderii, barley men. Not the most intimidating nickname, but nutritionally sound. They also received medical care. Surprisingly advanced medical care. We even know the name of one famous physician associated with gladiators, Galen. Before becoming one of antiquity's most influential medical writers, he worked treating wounded fighters in Pergamon. Which means gladiators, paradoxically, sometimes received better healthcare than ordinary citizens. Because they were valuable. A defeated gladiator who survived would be treated. Wounds stitched. Bones set. Muscles bandaged. And then, eventually, he would train again. Because losing once did not end a career. In fact, many famous gladiators lost multiple times. Records from tombstones and graffiti show win-loss ratios. A fighter might have 20 victories, and 5 defeats. Which suggests an arena career that was more like a brutal sport than a guaranteed execution. Of course, not everyone was spared. If a gladiator performed poorly. If he seemed cowardly. If the crowd demanded blood and the sponsor wanted applause. Then the decision could go the other way. And execution in the arena was not always immediate. Sometimes the defeated fighter was dispatched by the victor. Cleanly, ideally. A swift thrust to the neck. Other times, attendants dressed as mythological figures, even as the god Mercury, would test the body with a heated iron to confirm death. Subtlety was not their specialty. But even in death, there was procedure. Bodies were removed efficiently. The sand was raked. The schedule continued. Rome liked its timetables. Now here is something softer. Gladiators who survived long enough could earn freedom. After a certain number of victories, or through exceptional skill, a gladiator might receive a wooden sword called a rudis. This symbolized release from obligation. Retirement. Imagine surviving years of orchestrated violence, and being handed a small piece of carved wood. Some retired gladiators became trainers. Some became bodyguards. A few even became minor celebrities. Women left graffiti expressing admiration. Which feels oddly modern. Of course, freedom did not erase scars. Or trauma. Or missing years. But it was something. And then there were those who were too injured to continue. Severe wounds could end a career without ending a life. A man with a crippled leg, or damaged arm, might be discharged. Possibly freed. Possibly sold into another kind of labor. It depended on his owner. It depended on his value. It depended, as most things did in Rome, on money. Let's drift for a moment to the Colosseum itself. The great amphitheater, completed under Emperor Titus in 80 CE, could hold tens of thousands of spectators. When a gladiator lost there, it happened before an audience larger than many modern stadiums. And yet, statistically, most professional gladiators had about a 1 in 5 chance of dying in any given match. Dangerous, certainly. But not inevitable. This wasn't random slaughter. It was structured violence with economic logic. Which feels very Roman. There were also different categories of fighters. Some were heavily armored and expected to endure. Others were more lightly equipped and relied on agility. The pairing often aimed for balance. The crowd enjoyed suspense more than swift endings. If everyone died immediately, the roster would empty rather quickly. Now, there is another group we should mention. The Noxii. These were condemned criminals forced into the arena for execution. They were not trained gladiators. They were stage victims. Sometimes placed in mythological reenactments where the ending was always fatal. Their fate was different. Their defeat was predetermined. But our focus tonight is on the professionals. The men who trained. Who hoped to survive long enough to retire. Who navigated this strange career path in the shadow of empire. What happened to them after they lost? Often, they went back to work. They rested. Healed. Trained. Fought again. And occasionally, they built reputations precisely because they endured defeat and returned. Resilience was marketable. There's something oddly human in that. A man falls in front of thousands. He raises a finger. The crowd murmurs. The sponsor calculates. And then, instead of death, he receives another chance. Not out of mercy, but out of economics. Which, in the Roman world, was practically the same thing. So as we let the sand settle for tonight, remember this: losing in the arena did not always mean dying beneath the sun. Sometimes it meant limping back through the gate. Back to the barracks. Back to barley porridge. And preparing, quietly, for another afternoon of carefully regulated violence. Let's drift now from warm Roman sand to something cooler. Quieter. Wooden houses. Narrow lanes. A meeting house where sermons lasted longer than anyone's patience. We're in 1692. In the small, anxious community of Salem, in the colony of Massachusetts Bay Colony. It is winter. Which already makes everything worse. Cold has a way of sharpening tempers. And in this particular village, tempers were already sharpened like kitchen knives. Tonight we're asking, gently and without theatrical thunder. What really happened to the women accused of witchcraft? Not the folklore version. Not the Halloween version with pointed hats and theatrical cackling. But the slower, sadder version. The one involving paperwork. Depositions. Petty grudges. And neighbors who had known each other far too long. It began, as so many historical disasters do, with a handful of young girls behaving strangely. In January 1692, the daughter and niece of the local minister, Samuel Parris, began experiencing fits. Screaming. Convulsions. Complaints of invisible biting. Naturally, instead of considering stress, boredom, or the limited entertainment options of Puritan New England, the adults concluded the devil was involved. Because of course they did. A local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, suggested witchcraft. Which was not a small suggestion. It was the equivalent of lighting a match in a very dry forest. Soon, the girls began naming names. The first accused were women who were already on the margins of society. An enslaved woman named Tituba. A homeless beggar, Sarah Good. And an elderly woman who had missed church services, Sarah Osborne. Notice the pattern. Social vulnerability. Isolation. Mild nonconformity. Once accused, they were brought before local magistrates. Questioned in crowded rooms. Watched by neighbors. Observed by the afflicted girls, who conveniently fell into fits at strategic moments. The questioning was not subtle. Have you seen the devil? Why does this child react when you look at her? Who else is in league with you? Tituba, under pressure, confessed. Confessions, it turns out, were rewarded with survival. She described black dogs. Red cats. A tall man in dark clothing. She elaborated, perhaps realizing that dramatic storytelling was safer than stubborn denial. The other two women denied everything. They were jailed. And this is where the quieter suffering begins. Because before anyone was hanged, there were months of imprisonment. Cold cells. Chains. Little food. Accused women waited for trial while hysteria expanded like a stain spreading across linen. By spring, accusations multiplied. Respected church members were named. Wealthier women. Even a former minister. One of the most famous accused was Rebecca Nurse. She was elderly. Pious. Well regarded. Which did not protect her. In fact, it made things worse. If even Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then clearly the devil was extremely organized. Trials were held in a special court established by colonial Governor William Phips. The court accepted something called spectral evidence. This meant that if someone claimed your spirit appeared to them in a dream and pinched them, that counted. Which feels legally fragile. The accused women were often asked to recite the Lord's Prayer. Any stumble might be interpreted as guilt. Given the stress of public trial and possible execution, stumbles were not uncommon. On June 10, 1692, the first execution took place. Bridget Bishop was hanged. And then it accelerated. 19 people were executed by hanging over the following months. 14 were women. 5 were men. Another man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with stones after refusing to enter a plea. Which is a grim detail we will handle softly. He endured 2 days of increasing weight and reportedly asked for more weight. A stubborn end. But our focus remains on the women. Most were not wild mystics. They were widows. Midwives. Property holders. Women who argued with neighbors about fences or inheritance. In Puritan society, women had limited legal independence. Yet widows sometimes controlled property, which made them inconvenient. Accusations could untangle inheritance disputes rather efficiently. Because once jailed, property could be seized. Livestock sold. Fields neglected. The process was socially devastating. Families fractured. Children left without mothers. Husbands forced to publicly denounce wives in hopes of saving themselves. And here's something often forgotten, not all accused were executed. Around 150 people were accused in total. Many spent months in prison. Conditions were harsh. Some died there, awaiting trial. When a woman was finally acquitted or released, life did not simply resume. She returned to a community that had testified against her. Imagine walking back into church. Finding your neighbor in the pew beside you. The same neighbor who swore your spirit had strangled her in the night. Awkward does not begin to cover it. By October 1692, the hysteria began to falter. Prominent citizens were now being accused. Including the governor's own wife. At that point, skepticism blossomed rather conveniently. Governor Phips dissolved the special court. Spectral evidence was disallowed. Trials slowed. Prisoners were gradually released. By May 1693, the crisis was effectively over. But what happened to the women who survived? Some petitioned for compensation. Years later, in 1711, the colony passed legislation restoring rights and offering financial restitution to families of the accused. Money cannot restore reputation. But it was something. Rebecca Nurse's family eventually reinterred her remains in a proper grave. Others received formal apologies decades later. It took time for the colony to admit error. Public repentance days were declared. Judges expressed regret. One judge, Samuel Sewell, stood before his congregation and admitted guilt. Which, in Puritan New England, was no small gesture. But the women themselves? They had endured imprisonment. Public humiliation. The threat of death. Their names became shorthand for hysteria. And culturally, they were reshaped into symbols. Over time, Salem became less about the specific individuals and more about the idea of witch hunts. In literature. In politics. In metaphor. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, would later use the trials as allegory. Transforming 1692 into commentary on 20th century fear. Which means these women, who once sat in cold wooden courtrooms, became eternal examples. There's something both tragic and strangely enduring about that. Now let's gently consider one more layer. Many of the accused women were outspoken. They challenged authority. They quarreled publicly. They existed imperfectly in a society that preferred female silence. It would be overly neat to call the trials a coordinated attack on independent women. History is rarely that tidy. But it is fair to say that vulnerability, gender, and social tension intersected powerfully. Fear made ordinary disagreements feel apocalyptic. Religion amplified suspicion. Winter did the rest. And so what really happened to the witch women of Salem? Some were executed. Some died in prison. Many were eventually released, exhausted, impoverished, reputationally damaged. A few lived long enough to see apologies. All of them lived through a moment when their community decided that invisible harm felt more convincing than visible innocence. And then, gradually, quietly, the fever broke. The meeting house returned to sermons about other sins. Fields were replanted. Children grew up. The wooden gallows were dismantled. Salem moved on. Though not entirely. Today the town leans into its history. Visitors walk the streets. Museums display transcripts. Names once whispered in fear are printed on plaques. Time has a way of sanding down hysteria into heritage. But beneath the gift shops and guided tours lies the quieter truth. These were not fairy tale witches. They were neighbors. They were mothers. They were inconvenient. And for a few long months in 1692, that was enough. So let's let the New England air cool around us. The snow outside the meeting house. The murmured prayers. The uneasy glances between pews. And we'll drift onward, slowly, to the next royal misfortune. Let's drift now from chilly New England courtrooms to candlelit stone halls. The air is warmer here. Thicker. Perfumed with beeswax, damp wool, and quiet political desperation. Tonight we settle into the long corridors of medieval Europe, where royal daughters were not so much raised, as prepared. Like treaties with hair. So dim the lights a little further. Because this story is not loud. It is patient. It is about survival through silk gowns and arranged vows. How did royal women survive forced marriages in medieval Europe? Not emotionally thrive. Not romantically flourish. Simply, survive. From childhood, a princess's future was rarely her own. If she was born into a ruling house in places like Kingdom of France or Kingdom of England, her cradle might as well have been a diplomatic envelope. By the age of 6 or 7, negotiations were often already underway. Her dowry calculated. Her fertility discussed as though it were an agricultural forecast. Because of course it was. Royal marriages were not about affection. They were about alliances. Land. Ceasefires. Claims to thrones that might not even exist yet. And so a girl might grow up knowing that one day she would be sent away. To a foreign court. To a man she had never met. Possibly decades older. Possibly already unpleasant. Possibly both. Let's consider Isabella of France. Married at age 12 to Edward II of England. 12. At that age, most modern children are still arguing about bedtime. Isabella was negotiating the volatile politics of the English court. Edward II, unfortunately, was not especially attentive to his young queen. He had favorites. Close companions. Political distractions. Naturally, this made things worse. Isabella endured years of neglect and humiliation. But she did something quietly remarkable. She learned. She observed court factions. She built alliances. Eventually, she would orchestrate an invasion of England, depose her husband, and rule as regent for her son. Which is one way to cope with a disappointing marriage. But not every queen had the appetite for rebellion. Many survived through subtler means. One strategy was piety. Religion offered an acceptable refuge. A queen who leaned heavily into devotion could carve out autonomy through patronage of monasteries, convents, and religious foundations. Take Margaret of Scotland. Married to Malcolm III, she cultivated an image of deep religious reform. Through charity and church influence, she shaped Scottish court culture. Was she entirely content? That's harder to know. But she secured influence. And influence, in medieval courts, was oxygen. Another strategy was motherhood. Producing heirs was both obligation and shield. A queen who bore sons gained leverage. Her position stabilized. Her children became bargaining tools. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine. Married first to Louis VII of France. The marriage was strained. Louis was devout. Eleanor was politically astute and energetic. Their temperaments clashed like mismatched armor. After 15 years and 2 daughters, the marriage was annulled. Within weeks, Eleanor married Henry II of England. Which was either bold romanticism or extremely strategic timing. Possibly both. As Queen of England, she bore 8 children. Including Richard the Lionheart and King John. Motherhood secured her place in history. It also did not prevent imprisonment when she later supported her sons in rebellion. Survival did not mean comfort. It meant endurance. Now, let's gently address the more difficult reality. Many royal marriages involved significant age gaps. Young girls married men twice or 3 times their age. Physical consummation could be traumatic. Though medieval sources often veil such details in polite language. Medical knowledge was limited. Childbirth was dangerous. Queens were expected to produce heirs quickly. Repeated pregnancies weakened bodies. Some women retreated inward. Letters from the period occasionally reveal loneliness. Homesickness. The ache of being transplanted. Imagine leaving the only language you know. Arriving at a court where customs differ. Food tastes unfamiliar. Faces scrutinize you constantly. Every gesture analyzed. Every misstep reported. A queen's survival often depended on building a household of loyal attendants from her homeland. Ladies-in-waiting became emotional anchors. Shared language in a foreign hall was a quiet rebellion. Then there was diplomacy. Some queens embraced their role as mediators between their birth families and marital kingdoms. Blanche of Castile became regent for her son Louis IX and proved fiercely capable. She navigated revolts. Managed nobles. Preserved the crown. Her marriage had been arranged. Her authority was not. She carved it out. Of course, not all stories are triumphant. Let's drift to Anne of Bohemia. Married to Richard II of England, her union was politically useful but financially controversial. The English grumbled about the dowry. Anne herself was reportedly gentle and well-liked. She bore no children. Her inability to produce an heir shadowed her queenship. When she died young, Richard was reportedly devastated. Affection had grown. Which is perhaps one of the quieter survival mechanisms, time. Occasionally, companionship emerged. Not always. But sometimes. Now we must address inbreeding. Because dynasties, obsessed with keeping power pure, often married cousins. Repeatedly. This narrowed genetic diversity and widened political tension. The House of Habsburg perfected this approach. Which resulted, generations later, in Charles II of Spain. Charles was physically fragile, chronically ill. His family tree resembled a wreath. Royal women within such dynasties carried immense pressure. They were expected to repair genetic stagnation by producing healthy heirs, while often being close relatives of their husbands. It was biologically unfair, emotionally taxing, and politically relentless. So how did they survive? Some cultivated art and culture. Patronage created legacy beyond reproduction. Others maneuvered behind the scenes, influencing appointments, whispering counsel, managing correspondence networks that stretched across Europe. Letters were lifelines. A queen might maintain secret channels with her natal family. Information was power. And sometimes, survival meant strategic withdrawal. Convents offered escape. A widowed queen could choose religious life and step away from court politics, which, after years of ceremonial smiling, may have felt like relief. There were also quieter, daily acts of endurance. Learning the local language. Adapting dress. Mastering court etiquette. Small adjustments that prevented isolation from becoming exile. It's tempting to imagine these women as perpetual victims. But that flattens them. They were constrained. Yes. But within constraint, many exercised agency. Subtle. Incremental. Occasionally explosive. And sometimes survival was simply living long enough to outlast critics. Medieval courts were unstable ecosystems. Kings died in battle. Nobles revolted. Plagues arrived uninvited. A queen who remained steady through chaos could emerge unexpectedly powerful. So how did royal women survive forced marriages? Through adaptation. Through alliance building. Through motherhood, piety, culture, diplomacy. Through patience. Through, occasionally, rebellion. They survived by understanding that while their marriage may have been arranged, their influence did not have to be. And as we let the candlelight flicker lower in this stone hall, we can almost see them. Seated beside men chosen for them. Listening carefully. Smiling when required. Calculating when necessary. Waiting. Because in medieval Europe, survival was rarely dramatic. It was sustained. Quiet. Intentional. And often far more strategic than the chroniclers cared to admit. So rest now in the hush of the tapestry-lined chamber. The distant echo of footsteps in corridors. And we'll drift onward soon, to another royal household where bloodlines tangled and tempers flared. Let's drift north now. Far north. Where the air is colder, the daylight shorter, and the politics, surprisingly domestic. Tonight we leave behind medieval stone castles and move into timber longhouses, where the fire never quite goes out and the roof smells faintly of smoke and sheep. We're in Scandinavia. Somewhere between the 8th and 11th centuries. The age of the Vikings. And while longships slice across grey water toward the coasts of England and Francia, we're staying behind. Because the question is quieter than battle. What did Viking women actually do, while the men were raiding? Not the shield maiden legends. Not the dramatic slow-motion charge. But the daily rhythm. The long winter management. The steady endurance. Because as it turns out, someone had to keep the entire society functioning. And that someone was usually a woman. When men left on raids, they were often gone for months. Sometimes longer. Which meant farms, livestock, trade, and household governance continued without them. Viking farms were not decorative cottages. They were working enterprises. Cattle needed feeding. Sheep needed shearing. Fields needed tending. Food needed preserving before winter arrived and politely refused to leave for half the year. In a typical Norse household, the woman, often called the husfreyja, held the keys to storage chests. Literal keys. Archaeologists have found ornate key sets buried with women in Viking graves. A quiet symbol of authority. Control of the keys meant control of resources. And control of resources meant power. While men sought silver abroad, women managed survival at home. They oversaw textile production, which was not a minor task. Cloth in the Viking Age was labor-intensive. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun, woven. A sail for a longship required vast quantities of woven wool. So while warriors are remembered for dramatic landings, entire fleets quietly depended on women's textile labor. Without sails, there are no raids. It's a detail the sagas mention less frequently. Because loom work is less cinematic than axe work. But no less vital. Women also handle trade. Not grand foreign diplomacy, but local exchange. Surplus dairy, woven goods, crafted items, these moved through regional networks. In places like Hedeby, archaeological evidence suggests active marketplaces where women likely participated. And then there was law. Norse society had legal assemblies called things. While men typically represented households publicly, women could initiate divorce. Yes. Divorce. If a husband was absent too long, failed to provide, or behaved poorly, a woman could declare separation before witnesses. It required procedure. It required boldness. But it was possible. Which feels unexpectedly modern for a society famous for axes. Let's gently address the shield maiden question. Were there female warriors? The sagas, written later, in Christianized Iceland, tell stories of women like Lagertha. They wield swords. Command troops. Inspire awe. Archaeology has complicated the picture. One famous grave in Birka contained weapons and was long assumed to belong to a male warrior. Later DNA testing revealed the skeleton was female. Which sparked lively academic discussion. Does this mean she fought? Possibly. Or she held high status associated with warfare. The truth is measured. Some women may have taken up arms. But most did not spend their afternoons sharpening swords. They were busy ensuring winter stores did not fail. And winter, in Scandinavia, is not forgiving. Now let's step inside the longhouse. It is a long timber structure, shared by family, servants, sometimes animals. The central hearth burned steadily. Here, women supervised food production. Dried fish. Smoked meats. Cheese. Ale brewing. Ale was essential. Water quality was inconsistent. Brewing required skill and careful fermentation. So while men toasted victories abroad, women ensured the cups were filled at home. Childrearing was also central. Viking children were raised with expectation of resilience. Boys would one day raid. Girls would one day manage. Skills were taught early. Spinning. Animal care. Household arithmetic, the quiet math of survival. And here's something important. When men died abroad, which happened often, women became widows with authority. A widow could inherit property. Run estates. Arrange marriages for her children. In some cases, she might not remarry. Independence, though born of loss, could be substantial. The sagas mention formidable widows who defended land claims and pursued legal battles. Because Norse society, for all its violence, valued honor and legal procedure. Insults could lead to feuds. Land disputes could last generations. Women participated in these negotiations. Sometimes by urging restraint. Sometimes by encouraging vengeance. Human motivations rarely stay tidy. There's also the spiritual realm. Norse religion included figures known as vulva, seeresses. These women practiced forms of ritual magic called seer. They traveled between settlements, performed ceremonies, advised leaders. A vulva held social power. She interpreted omens, predicted outcomes. In a culture deeply attentive to fate, that mattered. Even the god Odin was said to practice seer, though somewhat controversially. Which tells you the role was significant. Now let's gently examine daily isolation. Life in rural Scandinavia could be lonely. Long winters. Limited daylight. Storms that sealed fjords. Women managed emotional resilience alongside physical survival. Community gatherings were essential. Feasts. Seasonal festivals. Shared weaving sessions. These were social glue. While raids created wealth, daily cooperation sustained life. And here's the quiet irony. Viking expansion depended on stable homesteads. Without strong farms, there are no ships. Without skilled textile work, there are no sails. Without careful food preservation, there are no crews returning to warm meals. So while history often spotlights men leaping from boats onto foreign shores, the continuity of Norse society rested heavily on women who stayed, managed, endured. There were, of course, constraints. Marriage was often arranged. Gender roles were defined. Violence existed within households as it did outside them. But compared to some contemporary European societies, Norse women retained notable legal rights. They could own property, request divorce, represent family interests. It was not equality, but it was agency. Let's pause gently on one more image. A longship returning. Sails lowered. Hull heavy with stolen silver. Men stepping onto shore, louder than necessary. Behind them stands the woman who has spent months maintaining land, livestock, and law. Her reward? Perhaps new trade goods. Perhaps a husband who survived. Perhaps grief. Perhaps both. She listens to the stories, assesses the wealth, and begins calculating how it will be distributed, stored, invested into next season's planting. Because raids were episodic, but farm management was constant. So what did Viking women actually do while the men were raiding? They ran economies. They preserved culture. They raised generations. They occasionally divorced disappointing husbands. They may, sometimes, have lifted swords. But more often, they lifted responsibility. And responsibility, as history quietly shows us, is heavier than steel. So let the northern wind soften now. The longhouse fire dimming. The loom resting for the night. Outside, the fjord is calm. Tomorrow, there will be wool to spin. Cattle to check. Legal disputes to revisit. And somewhere in the distance, perhaps, a sail on the horizon. History tends to remember the sail. But survival belonged to the shore. And with that gentle thought, we'll drift onward soon, deeper into dynasties where bloodlines twisted and royal tempers flared.